Our next speaker is Dr. Alison Thimblin, and I see that your video is on, which is wonderful. So Dr. Alison Thimblin serves as the College Dean of Mathematics at Northern Virginia Community College and as the Dean of Mathematics, Science, Technologies, and Business Division at the Woodbridge campus of Nova. She's taught mathematics at the college level for over 20 years, starting at the University of Oklahoma and then Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas. After a very brief stint as an actuary for the federal government, she returned to her passion of teaching as an adjunct at Marymount University. Her career in the VCCS started as an adjunct at Germanna Community College before joining Nova as a full-time faculty in 2004, teaching a wide variety of courses. Her passions include teaching mathematics, exploring ways to provide students with the support they need to be successful, and helping faculty develop the craft of teaching. She's earned a Master's of Science degree in mathematics from the University of Oklahoma and a Doctorate of Arts in Community College Education from George Mason University. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to enter those in the chat section at the bottom of the Zoom room screen, and we will address them at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Dr. Thimblin.
Thanks, Daisy. Appreciate that. Hi, everyone. Good to see at least the black boxes with everyone's names in it on a Friday afternoon. So I think I can share my screen here. So I'll go ahead and do that. So today's session is really on, can somebody just give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen, or you can see a PowerPoint slide of some sort?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Okay, very good. So, Lynn Ryan, I think, is attending as well, and we kind of had complimentary ideas about a presentation for VMATYC this weekend, and so this is kind of like part one of a discussion that will continue tomorrow morning with her presentation. And so we're talking about placement into higher level math in a direct enrollment placement world. And so, whoops, let me back up a second. And so just a quick introduction. I've been at Nova, I think, for 17 years now. Started out as a math faculty at the Annandale campus, and I'm currently located at the Woodbridge campus and serve as the Dean of Math for the college. And Nova is a phase 2 college in terms of implementation for direct enrollment, meaning that we started with the direct enrollment rules for placement this current fall. Although last year was, I don't know what phase anybody was in last year, but there was a lot going on last year with COVID and the lack of the VPT and moving to virtual instruction. But we had our two mentor colleges were Germanna and Reynolds, and the math faculty and leadership there provide us with a lot of guidance for implementation for direct enrollment. And we put a great team together of faculty to prepare for direct enrollment. And so one of the questions that came up for us is that, we understand the rules for placement into 154. I should just have as a side note, excuse me, Nova doesn't offer Math 155. We're thinking about starting to offer it in the fall. It really depends on if our liberal arts degree and social sciences degree will consider accepting that, now that we have like the transfer VA work and the SHEV work that was done with the passport courses and the UCGS. That 155 transfers a lot better to Nova's top transfer partners than it did about a year or so ago. So that's why you won't see anything related to Math 155 on our, in the talk today. But we understand the rules for placement into 154 and then into pre-calc, right? And so we said, well, when we had the VPT, we were able to place students into what we're calling higher level math. And so when we say higher level math, we mean pre-calc 2, stats 1, applied calc 1, and calc 1. And so we know that we have a population of students just like you, right, that may be ready for those courses, but the direct enrollment rules don't really give us any guidance on how to place those students. So we have large populations of students, like many of you do, who take AP or IB courses, right? And so we have standards in place with our credit for prior learning manual that awards credit for courses based on IB and AP exam scores, but doesn't give us any guidance for placement, right? So a student might get credit for 263, but using the direct enrollment rules, they can only place as high as pre-calc. And so we wanted to put something, because we're a multi-campus college, we wanted to put something consistent in place to give students who may be ready an opportunity. We also have a large population of international students with foreign high school transcripts. And sometimes that foreign high school transcript, when it's been evaluated by an ACES accepted a facility, it just says mathematics 1, and we don't have a sense of what mathematics 1 is, right? And sometimes we can't get enough information from the student to know what they're ready for. And then we also have, on a much, much smaller scale, other non-traditional students with some kind of math experience that whether it's something they attempted at a prior college years ago or through their work, and then, they may be ready for something higher level than either the 154 or pre-calc. And so what we ran into is that we just don't know a lot about how students do in math courses at Nova, right? Based on what they took in high school. Like if a student took AP Calculus AB, didn't get a high enough score to get credit for the course, we don't know if they're ready for calculus or not. And like you can see both sides of it, right? Well, they've seen it before. They got an A or B in the course. We know that's not the exact same as a math 261 or math 263, but they've demonstrated some competency. Should they have to start in pre-calc because they didn't get credit for the calculus course? And so we wanted to put some consistent rules together so that regardless of which campus the student requested the permission to take the course, we would give them a consistent answer. And so at Nova, we have faculty course work groups. So we have like a course work group for Math 263, faculty from each of our campuses that when we have a question regarding 263, kind of goes to that group to ponder and to make recommendations. Last year, when we didn't have the VPT because of COVID, and we were using the practice VPT for placement, we still had the same problem. What about placement into higher level math? And so we got permission from the VCCS to develop a readiness assessment. We're trying really hard not to call it a placement test for those higher level math courses. And so it's questions that were written by math faculty. They're no multiple choice, it's short answer. The students have a time limit. It's delivered virtually. We've got a pool of questions. So it's just a somewhat robust assessment. And we haven't had the time to track the data yet to see how those students are doing, how they did in their math courses last year or how they're doing this year. So that's something that we definitely want to learn, because that goes back to our first question. What do we know about students that either were placed by this readiness assessment, placed because of what courses they took in high school? And it's difficult for us to capture that data, right? Because it doesn't live in SIS in a way that we can pull the data. So for instance, we can measure or we can get the data on students who are placed into pre-calc because of the way that that data is kept in SIS. But for students that we put in a student group or we give permission to take 263, all those reasons are different for the student grouping. So that remains a challenge, but we're working to overcome that. So I just thought that today we kind of share what we put in place for placement into those higher level math courses at Nova, and then open it up for discussion. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 schools of what you're thinking about, what seems to work for you. If there's things that you're saying, no, we're not going to consider placement into higher level math, or some other, I'll present what we've considered. And then if you have some other things that you've considered, I'd love to hear them. So for placement into higher level math, there's nothing automated about it. It requires, and I really should put in there, manual SIS student grouping. And we asked that whoever does this student grouping, that it has to include detailed notes. So over the past year, we had a very small group of, at first it was math faculty, then it transitioned to one of our staff members in student services that does this placement into higher level math, because we had very strict criteria and we wanted very tight control over that. Now we're opening it up to all advisors. They have the criteria now that we've been using it for over a year. And so the first criteria is that for recent high school graduates, you have to have at least placed into, we're saying Math 167. So in other words, that you have a high school GPA of at least 3.0 and have taken at least Algebra 2. So it's not a way for students that placed into pre-calc with MDE or 154 with MDE or just MDE 10 or 60. It's not a way for them to bypass any of the direct enrollment rules. They've maxed out the direct enrollment rules and want to see if they can place higher. Okay. And then we asked for a copy of their high school transcript, because some of the standards are based on the grade they got in the high school course. And at first that was a little bit troublesome for our student services personnel. They're saying, no, we're not allowed to ask for high school transcripts. And we got clarity from that from the VCCS. They said, no, for placement into higher level math, it's up to each college, right? And so if we need a copy of the high school transcript, that was fine with them. So, just like all of you, you'll have students that pass the prerequisite course with a grade of C or better at another community college or another university. And obviously we let the student register for the course at Nova, but again, that requires the student grouping. But our advisors really need to have that spelled out. And then we have a group of non-traditional students and those with non-US high school transcripts. We have a math placement email that, one student services person staffs that right now. If they have questions about placement into higher level math, and then she works with myself and the associate deans that are over math at each campus to say, okay, where does this student really belong? It's usually a conversation with the student. Okay, so we put together this chart. And so we had training with our advisors, and I use that term very generally, meaning honestly, anybody that helps a student. And so we just wanted to make it clear that this is not to bypass any of the direct enrollment rules. The student should have a 3.0 GPA or higher, so recent high school graduates with a high school GPA of 3.0 or higher, and they have to have taken Algebra 2. Otherwise, this chart doesn't apply. And so one thing that we have found, which you have found as well, right, is that direct enrollment survey doesn't necessarily have all the classes listed that students in your service areas may have taken, right? So, so there's a lot of courses that we'll see on transcripts that's not quite on the direct enrollment survey. So sometimes students don't answer the survey as accurately as they could have. Had they known that, oh, that's what you meant by this class. One course that's particularly problematic for us is that we have a fundamental algebra course that's kind of like an instead of Algebra 2, but it's lower than Algebra 2. But I'm digressing, so I'll come back to this. So, so we looked at the most popular courses that students in our service area take, and then each of our course work groups, the faculty that are on the course work group for Math 162, for instance, they looked and said, okay, what would we consider, just based on what we know, and sometimes it's gut feeling, right, about whether or not the student should be permitted to take Math 162. So not giving them credit for 161, but allowing them to enroll just placement into 162. And so they came up with these standards that are in this first column here. We get very few students that request placement into 162. By far, the most students are requesting placement into 263, and then 245 and 261. It's probably about an even split. And then very, very few students who request placement into 264. And honestly, that's done on a very case-by-case basis with conversations with a student in depth. I think we've had a total of 3 students in the past year and a half. And so if we look at the 263 column, for instance, if a student took pre-calc without trig in high school, we're not going to consider them for placement into 263. They obviously need some kind of history, some kind of learning experience with trig. And so we know that we have students that take pre-calc with trig in high school. Maybe they didn't have the opportunity to take calculus, or they just didn't get that far by their senior year. If they get a grade of A, we allow them to take that Canvas assessment, that Canvas readiness assessment. So, and then they have to score a certain, at a certain level on that readiness assessment for us to permit them to take Math 263. And so we have about, since we used it last year, we have about a year's worth of data now that we're starting to do the data analysis. So we can see, okay, for those students that got the A and took the Canvas assessment, how did those students do in the calculus course? Did they enroll, right? Because sometimes we give them permission, but they don't necessarily enroll. The one that we see by far the most is that students who take AP Calculus A, B, or BC. So they've taken the course, they got an A or a B, but they didn't necessarily do, well, they didn't do well enough on the AP exam to get credit for the course, right? So they took AP Calculus A, B, or BC, they got an A or a B, they didn't score well enough to get credit. And so that coursework group decided, well, if they got an A or a B in that course, we should allow them to take Math 263, right? But if their grade is C or lower, we want them to take the Canvas assessment first, the readiness assessment first. And then, you know, with this past year, with COVID and virtual learning, I'm sure we're seeing the same thing that you guys are seeing, that students may have gotten an A or a B in a course, but they don't necessarily have the skills that maybe previous classes of students would have had. Oh yeah, Cheryl, that's a really good point. Is the chart for students who took Algebra 2 or passed it with a C? So just, they took it, right? Because that's what how the direct enrollment placement works, right? Is that the student has a 3.0 high school GPA and they took Algebra 2. So that's how it's self-reported from the student. The student doesn't provide any proof that they've passed Algebra 2 or not, just that they've taken it. Or as we kind of tongue-in-cheek like to say, it appears on their transcript they've taken it. So and I'm hoping to have some good data based on the placement that we've seen so far on that readiness assessment to see how students do based on the math course they took in high school and then what they took at Nova. Okay. So you can see their standards based on what the grade they got in their high school course, and in some cases they're allowed to take a Canvas assessment, and sometimes the Canvas assessment isn't even an option for the student. Okay, so at this point, I thought I'd just kind of open it for discussion. I'm kind of curious for those of you that are in phase 1 and phase 2 schools, what you already have in process for placement in higher level math. For maybe the phase 3 schools, have you started thinking about it? For the phase 1 and 2 schools, what have you found that works for you, or maybe things that are most appropriate? Yeah, then go ahead and jump in.
Thanks, Allison. I was emailing Allison beforehand, and why am I? And I was telling her I didn't want to hijack her presentation, but I was going through the thing. I'm like, we're doing the same presentation. I mean, we're because I'm in the same position. I had about maybe 10-15 minutes to say, well, this is what Blue Ridge did. And then I was going to open the floor for discussion and say, so what are you guys all doing? So I thought maybe if we joined forces a little bit, if people would, because I do have some data. We were phase 1, and if the audience would like to listen to me for like 5 minutes just to kind of opine on this, I could kick that in there. And then if this conversation kind of continued into tomorrow's session, we could kind of keep talking about it then. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I share for?
Yeah, absolutely. I stopped sharing, so I think you should be able to. I don't know if Daisy has to give you permission to.
Oh, it looks like I can. It looks like
Okay.
I can. So that was really cool, Alison, because we took it in mostly a different direction. And the question I was going to have for people is small college versus large college, because I already knew when I started talking about some of the stuff that we were doing that it probably wouldn't be scalable to a Nova or a Tidewater. I can tell you the punchline for us, and this won't take long at all because Alison's covered all the introductory stuff, is that first of all, I would tell a brief funny story, and you'll have to hear it twice. So after they did that, I realized, well, they kind of overlooked the placement into upper level courses because we were phase 1. I went to our vice president, Bob, and he's heard me tell this story on him, so he'll survive. And I said, Bob, you left something out. And he's like, oh. And I said, well, is it all placement tests? Can I use like JMU's placement tests? Because he's like, all placement tests, no placement tests. I'm like, what do you want me to do, Bob? He said, well, could you interview them? I said, on the basis of what? And he said, maybe if you wrote some problems down on a piece of paper and you kind of pushed it over to the student and saw how they did on them. I said, Bob, that's a placement test. It's not a better placement test because I wrote it. But our take on it is, and I've had this for a while, and this comes out of also the Transfer Virginia work, is I've got equity concerns with placement testing in any way. And it's because pre-calculus to me is really interesting because I call it the course where if you most need the content, you least need the credit. Because what we're saying, coming out of Transfer Virginia is that pre-calculus isn't a super duper gen ed math. You mostly want to encourage people to take pre-calculus on the way to calculus. And if they're taking their calculus or their statistics and their applied calculus, those are the courses that count to their major. And those are the courses that check their gen ed box. And so that pre-calc often becomes those unapplied credits that they're talking about. In other words, if it's not checking your gen ed and it's not going towards your major, what's it doing? And so we make students pay for this course. And even with dual enrollment pre-calculus, there still is a cost involved. And I know that's very different throughout the system, but we are charging a certain amount per credit hour. And I thought, to me, this is an equity issue for us because we also have access issues with equity. And so we've got people right now in our more rural schools who are teaching literally the VCCS outcomes. I mean, they said that's what we use because that's what you sent us. And they are teaching a course that is basically equivalent to 162, 161, 162, or 167. And the only difference is they're not credentialed and they don't have one on site at that college that's credentialed to teach a dual enrollment course. So we're saying, okay, our students that are coming from Buffalo Gap and, from these places are already, again, they're going to have to, there's a tuition penalty here involved for them. So we went bold. We are using their high school pre-calculus to place them into calculus. And the only concern was that with their transcripts, if a course shows up in a transcript and it says pre-calculus, whatever, you don't really know what's in it. And so I became the pre-calculus czar. I would send them our outcomes. They would send them back and say, which ones did you do? And we based it on the course. I didn't want to be in an endless loop of instructor permission for students. I said, if your course is fundamentally the same as our pre-calculus course, we're going to approve that. And we use it for placement into calculus. We started small. We just stayed with like our AS STEM students, the ones that were actually heading on like the calculus track that are the least likely to use the credits. We're not as worried about like the business students because right now they have to have 6 credits of math anyway. So it was, a little bit more limited that way. And I can tell you the punchline here. I'll jump to it really quickly because I only take 5 minutes. The big takeaway was how few students actually went this route. This honestly shocked me. For 2021, we only had 15 students-ish even kind of have this conversation with an advisor. I'm telling you, this is a small school solution. And 9 of which were placed into Math 263. For fall 2021, I've got 19 students that apparently asked to do this. And if you want to know how they did, not any worse. I mean, you can't run statistics with 9 at an N of 9. But when I did pull the numbers, and here's sort of a larger breakdown, this was how they all broke down. And that would have been 161, 167, or did the pilot is what I'm talking about using the high schools. Or then there was this great category called other, which was all kinds of wacky stuff. Like they had AP credit for calculus, but still need to read, you know what I mean? They had a 3 and they need a 4, stuff like that. And so when we did the comparisons, I mean, the very first blush of data at least says this isn't working any worse. So we're keeping doing it this year, and hopefully we'll have bigger numbers to report out. And so that's Blue Ridge. So there you go.
Yeah, and I wish we I wish we could consider it on a like a student by student kind of conversation with a student and looking at their I don't have the data in front of me, and I should have made a slide with it, but even for the Canvas assessments, we've had hundreds of students take the Canvas assessment. And we have a pretty high threshold. You have to score an 80% in order to place into. What anecdotally, what we prior to the fall, we had a group of 5 math faculty that would grade the assessments because they were all short answer. And the students had to type their answers into Canvas. We didn't want pictures of work or anything else. We wanted them to do it within the 2-hour time period. So we had to create a module for them to practice writing math in Canvas, right? Because that's something that takes time to learn how to do. But once we've got all those kind of monkey wrenches out of the way, what we found was even students that we were giving permission to had such low performance on what we considered some very fundamental questions. We based the questions on the Canvas readiness assessment on our student learning outcome questions. And so, you know, things like finding the zero of a polynomial, you know, there's a good number of questions that require reading comprehension in order to answer them. And they're welcome, you know, it's a virtual assessment. It's not proctored, right? We don't have any kind of respondus monitor or anything else tracking the students. We know that they're going to be using, you know, their phone and everything else. And still the success rates aren't very good. And it's just anecdotally, the lack of success on some of the problems was really troubling, especially for students that had like AP calculus or something like that in high school. So, you know, so I think that we tried to find some kind of middle ground, right? That, you know, the students took calculus in high school, they were exposed to calculus before. Should we give them the opportunity rather than just having one single assessment determine whether or not they take a class or not? So trying to, I think Zach Beamer had presented on the direct enrollment rules this time last year about, you know, like error on the side of higher placement, right? That if they took AP calculus in high school and got an A or a B, they've already taken calculus. They should be able to take calculus now, right? And so, so that's kind of, I think, a lot of the thinking that a lot of our groups used, but not with the pre-calculus in high school. Just I think it's because our service area is so large, we have such a wide variety of, even though the course title is the same, there's just not enough that we know about how pre-calc is offered in all of our service areas. I'm kind of curious to hear what some of the other colleges, the phase 1 or phase 2 colleges are doing for placement into higher level math. Are any of the phase 1 or phase 2 colleges just saying, nope, no placement into higher level, you must take the prerequisite? And you can go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Pablo. Your audio is a little bit spotty. Okay. I'm assuming it's not just my hearing. I think it was everyone. Or the phase 3 schools, have you guys given some thought to what you'll do for placement into higher level math and which way you're leaning towards? Yeah, so Lord Fairfax just put in the chat there. They're not considering it yet. The students need to pass the prereq course with a C. And we definitely have some faculty that felt strongly that way too, right? That no, you've got to take the course. If you don't have like the AP credit to earn the credit, then you need to take the course with a C. I know that at the last meeting, I believe it was the COD meeting, the Council of Deans and Directors for the VCCS, they were talking about perhaps the need for consistency for placement into higher level math, but they felt like that we, meaning the math leadership, right, the math faculty and math leadership, weren't ready to even to make a decision on anything or to have a proposal about those kinds of things. I think we still need some more time to figure out what's working. And we have very different populations of students too, right? So Lynn, for instance, like you've got a lot of students in your service area that they might not have the opportunity to take calculus at all, right? But they did well in pre-calculus, where in most of the schools in the service area in Northern Virginia, right? They've got oodles of sections of AP calculus, for instance. So the access to calculus in high school, it could be very different from in the different service areas. Okay, thanks for putting it in the chat, Jason. So no formal policy, subject to division approval, so a case-by-case basis. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, so most of your STEM students come in with dual enrollment credit in pre-calculus. Okay, that's interesting. So if they've already demonstrated that they've passed the college level pre-calculus, right, and high school with a grade of C or better, they're coming in with that. If those STEM students are coming in with that credit, so they'd place into calculus anyway. Yeah, that's a really good approach to it, right? That they've demonstrated that they've passed the college level pre-calc. I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on statistics. I know that, and I don't want to attribute it to either Germana or Reynolds, but I know that because in our conversations, we had a lot of conversations with both colleges, but I think one of the two had considered not having placement directly into 245, that students would have to take the prerequisite first. And so we decided to look at the coursework. If they took AP statistics, for instance, in high school, but didn't get the necessary grade on the exam, we would allow placement into statistics. Any other thoughts or comments about placement in the higher level math? Well, what I'd really encourage everyone to do, if at all possible, I know that it's a struggle for us as well, is to see if we can collect some data based on our various placement methods, and then see how those students do in the classes. Anyone using 161 as a prereq for stats. So I know at Nova we have students that take we have students that go from 161 into stats. They didn't take 154, they took 161 and maybe had a change of heart about the calculus part of pre-calculus and decided to switch majors, and now they need a second math course, so they'll take the statistics. So yes, but by far we see it's the 154, 245. Yeah, we're seeing the same thing, Laura, about I think that it's a double punch that we got this year, right? And for those of you that are in the phase 2 schools and phase 1 as well, is that we have the new placement rules, right? And so we have more students who have placed into pre-calculus. And so we have more underprepared students naturally, and their level of underpreparedness is deeper. But also because of COVID, right? And so we know that last year that learning did not happen as much as it would have in the past, right? And that students passed in their math class or whatever, and they may, because of the grade they received, have a false sense of confidence about how they do. And yeah, I see that in the chat. Teresa's at Nova as well. We really see a lot of students struggling in calculus this year. Anecdotally, I hear it from a lot of our faculty that students are they're just struggling with the fundamentals. And it's kind of, there's only so much support you can provide, but in calculus, if a student doesn't know how to factor, for instance, you really can't even get to helping them with the pre-calc material, let alone the calculus. So, but yeah, so or add fractions. Good point. Yeah, right. I keep on threatening to design a course called Fractions and Word Problems and make it mandatory for everyone. But so I think what we're going to continue to do at Nova is, track our data and see what we find, based on the standards that we have put in place to see if they're effective or not. And then, if the students are outperforming, the general population of students, maybe we're being a little bit too strong. So it just continues, right? So eventually it's going to get caught up. The students are going to get caught up that if their math skills are weak and they're going in that STEM route, eventually it'll catch up with them. Well, for those of you that are phase 3 schools, I encourage you to start thinking about it sooner than later. If you're thinking about placing into higher level math. And if you're a phase 1 or 2 school, love to get together to talk about the data that you have, if you have any, and what you've done, so we can make good decisions for our students.
And if I may just, Alison, thank you for letting me jump in for 5-7 minutes of your session there. I would invite anybody who's still around tomorrow that would like to see the extended play version of why we did what we did, and a little bit more detailed look at the process. So we'd like to keep this conversation going, because I think to me, the data is the very important thing. If I can look at these numbers and say, what, if they're not doing any worse this way than they do coming through our own classes, then I feel like there's a strong argument there for saying, well, we should treat these things as comparable, but it's going to be still needing better numbers and more numbers to see that.
Yeah, and I really think that the sooner we start tackling this discussion, the better. I would imagine that if maybe not in a year, but maybe in 2 years, the VCCS might come and say we need to develop some common standards. So it might be a good time if you haven't started to think about it, or track your data and start track the data based on how that student got into the course, right? Which isn't always the simplest thing to do. But thank you. It's good to see all of you.